Book 1, Chapter 17, of Resurrection. And so the evening passed, and night came. The doctor went to bed. Nekhludoff's aunts had also retired, and he knew that Matrona Pavlovna was now with them in their bedroom, so that Katusha was sure to be alone in the maid's sitting-room. He again went out into the porch. It was dark, damp, and warm out of doors, and that white spring mist which drives away the last snow, or is diffused by the thawing of the last snow, filled the air. From the river under the hill, about 100 steps from the front door, came a strange sound. It was the ice breaking. Nekhludoff came down the steps and went up to the window of the maid's room, stepping over the puddles on the bits of glazed snow. His heart was beating so fiercely in his breast that he seemed to hear it. His laboured breath came and went in a burst of long-drawn sighs. In the maid's room, a small lamp was burning, and Katusha sat alone by the table, looking thoughtfully in front of her. Nekhludoff stood a long time without moving, and waited to see what she, not knowing that she was observed, would do. For a minute or two she did not move. Then she lifted her eyes, smiled, and shook her head as if chiding herself, then changed her pose, and dropped both her arms on the table, and again began gazing down in front of her. He stood and looked at her, involuntarily listening to the beating of his own heart and the strange sounds from the river. There on the river, beneath the white mist, the unceasing labour went on, and sounds as of something sobbing, cracking, dropping, being shattered to pieces, mixed with the tinkling of the thin bits of ice as they broke against each other like glass. There he stood, looking at Katusha's serious, suffering face, which betrayed the inner struggle of her soul, and he felt pity for her. But, strange though it may seem, this pity only confirmed him in his evil intention. He knocked at the window. She started as if she had received an electric shock. Her whole body trembled, and a look of horror came into her face. Then she jumped up, approached the window, and brought her face up to the pane. The look of terror did not leave her face even when, holding her hands up to her eyes like blinkers, and peering through the glass, she recognized him. Her face was unusually grave. He'd never seen it so before. She returned his smile, but only in submission to him. There was no smile in her soul, only fear. He beckoned her with his hand to come out into the yard to him, but she shook her head and remained by the window. He brought his face close to the pane and was going to call out to her, but at that moment she turned to the door. Evidently someone inside had called her. Nekhludoff moved away from the window. The fog was so dense that 5 steps from the house the windows could not be seen, but the light from the lamp shone red and huge out of a shapeless black mass. And on the river the same strange sounds went on, sobbing and rustling and cracking and tinkling. Somewhere in the fog, not far off, a cock crowed. Another answered, and then others far in the village took up the cry, till the sound of the crowing blended into one, while all around was silent except the river. It was the second time the cocks crowed that night. Nekhludoff walked up and down behind the corner of the house, and once or twice got into a puddle, then again came up to the window. The lamp was still burning, and she was again sitting alone by the table, as if uncertain what to do. He had hardly approached the window when she looked up. He knocked. Without looking who it was, she at once ran out of the room, and he heard the outside door open with a snap. He waited for her near the side porch, and put his arms round her without saying a word. She clung to him, put up her face, and met his kiss with her lips. Then the door again gave the same sort of snap and opened, and the voice of Matrona Pavlovna called out angrily, "Katusha!" She tore herself away from him and returned into the maid's room. He heard the latch click and then all was quiet. The red light disappeared, and only the mist remained, and the bustle on the river went on. Nekhludoff went up to the window. Nobody was to be seen. He knocked, but got no answer. He went back into the house by the front door, but could not sleep. He got up and went with bare feet along the passage to her door, next to Matrona Pavlovna's room. He heard Matrona Pavlovna snoring quietly, and was about to go on when she coughed and turned on her creaking bed, and his heart fell, and he stood immovable for about 5 minutes. When all was quiet, and she began to snore peacefully again, he went on, trying to step on the boards that did not creak, and came to Katusha's door. There was no sound to be heard. She was probably awake, or else he would have heard her breathing. But as soon as he had whispered, "Katusha," she jumped up and began to persuade him, as if angrily, to go away. "Open! Let me in just for a moment, I implore you." He hardly knew what he was saying. When she left him, trembling and silent, giving no answer to his words, he again went out into the porch and stood, trying to understand the meaning of what had happened. It was getting lighter. From the river below, the creaking and tinkling and sobbing of the breaking ice came still louder, and a gurgling sound could now also be heard. The mist had begun to sink, and from above it the waning moon dimly lighted up something black and weird. What was the meaning of it all? Was it a great joy or a great misfortune that had befallen him? He asked himself. End of Book 1, Chapter 17. Book 1, Chapter 18, of Resurrection. The next day, the gay, handsome, and brilliant Schönbock joined Nekhludoff at his aunt's house, and quite won their hearts by his refined and amiable manner, his high spirits, his generosity, and his affection for Dmitri. But though the old ladies admired his generosity, it rather perplexed them, for it seemed exaggerated. He gave a rouble to some blind beggars who came to the gate, gave 15 roubles in tips to the servants, and when Sophia Ivanovna's pet dog hurt his paw and it bled, he tore his hem-stitched cambric handkerchief into strips. Sophia Ivanovna knew that such handkerchiefs cost at least 15 roubles a dozen, and bandaged the dog's foot. The old ladies had never met people of this kind, and did not know that Schönbock owed 200,000 roubles which he was never going to pay, and that therefore 25 roubles more or less did not matter a bit to him. Schönbock stayed only 1 day, and he and Nekhludoff both left at night. They could not stay away from their regiment any longer, for their leave was fully up. At the stage which Nekhludoff's selfish mania had now reached, he could think of nothing but himself. He was wondering whether his conduct, if found out, would be blamed much or at all, but he did not consider what Katusha was now going through, and what was going to happen to her. He saw that Schönbock guessed his relations to her, and this flattered his vanity. "Ah, I see how it is that you have taken such a sudden fancy to your aunts that you've been living nearly a week with them," Schönbock remarked when he'd seen Katusha. "Well, I don't wonder. Should have done the same. She's charming." Nekhludoff was also thinking that, though it was a pity to go away before having fully gratified the cravings of his love for her, yet the absolute necessity of parting had its advantages, because it put a sudden stop to relations it would have been very difficult for him to continue. Then he thought that he ought to give her some money, not for her, not because she might need it, but because it was the thing to do. So he gave her what seemed to him a liberal amount, considering his and her station. On the day of his departure, after dinner, he went out and waited for her at the side entrance. She flushed up when she saw him, and wished to pass by, directing his attention to the open door of the maid's room by a look, but he stopped her. "I've come to say good-bye," he said, crumbling in his hand an envelope with a 100-rouble note inside. She guessed what he meant, knit her brows, and, shaking her head, pushed his hand away. "Take it. Oh, you must," he stammered, and thrust the envelope into the bib of her apron, and ran back to his room, groaning and frowning as if he'd hurt himself. And for a long time he went up and down, writhing as in pain, and even stamping and groaning aloud as he thought of this last scene. "But what else could I have done? Is it not what happens to everyone? And if everyone does the same, well, I suppose it can't be helped." In this way he tried to get peace of mind, but in vain. The recollection of what had passed burned his conscience. In his soul, in the very depths of his soul, he knew that he had acted in a base, cruel, and cowardly manner, and that the knowledge of this act of his must prevent him not only from finding fault with anyone else, but even from looking straight into other people's eyes, not to mention the impossibility of considering himself a splendid, noble, high-minded fellow, as he did and had to do to go on living his life boldly and merrily. There was only one solution of the problem, that is, not to think about it. He succeeded in doing so. The life he now entered upon, the new surroundings, new friends, the war, all helped him to forget, and the longer he lived, the less he thought about it, until at last he forgot it completely. Only once, when, after the war, he went to see his aunts in hopes of meeting Katusha, and heard that soon after his last visit she had left, and that his aunts had heard she'd been confined somewhere or other, and had gone quite to the bad, his heart ached. According to the time of her confinement, the child might or might not have been his. His aunts said she'd gone wrong, that she'd inherited her mother's depraved nature, and he was pleased to hear this opinion of his aunts. It seemed to acquit him. At first he thought of trying to find her and her child, but then, just because in the depths of his soul he felt so ashamed and pained when thinking about her, he did not make the necessary effort to find her, but tried to forget his sin again and ceased to think about it. And now this strange coincidence brought it all back to his memory, and demanded from him the acknowledgment of the heartless, cruel cowardice which had made it possible for him to live these 9 years with such a sin on his conscience. But he was still far from such an acknowledgment, and his only fear was that everything might now be found out, and that she or her advocate might recount it all and put him to shame before everyone present. End of Book 1, Chapter 18.